Sri Lanka has been rocked by months of unrest. The country's president fled to the Maldives and then to Singapore after protesters laid siege to the presidential palace and several leaders' homes. Sri Lanka's House Speaker then announced the president's resignation.
ගරු ජනාධිපති ගෝඨාබය රාජපක්ෂ මැතිතුමා විසින් එවන ලද ඉල්ලා අස්වීමේ ලිපිය මා වෙත ලැබී ඇත.
The country is in the midst of its worst economic crisis since its independence. Its 22 million people have suffered for months from a lack of food, fuel, and medicine. A movement known as the Struggle, or Aragalaya in Sinhalese, has placed the blame on one family, the Rajapaksas. The family has held on to power in Sri Lanka for 2 decades. At one point, President Gotabaya and his brother, former Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa, were successful politicians, revered for their strong-handed approach to domestic terrorism and revitalizing the capital Colombo. But now, both are in hiding, having fled from their own people. So, what led to the Rajapaksa family's rise and fall from power? Sri Lanka's history in the 2000s is largely the story of the Rajapaksa brothers, Mahinda and Gotabaya. Mahinda Rajapaksa ascended to power in 2004 when he was tapped to be prime minister. The next year, he won the presidency and launched an all-out offensive against the militant separatist group, the LTTE, popularly known as the Tamil Tigers, which had been carrying out attacks in Sri Lanka since the 1970s. Mahinda's brother, Gotabaya, was appointed his defense secretary and came to be known as the Terminator after leading the army's victory over the LTTE. In 2010, Mahinda won a second term as president and swiftly amended the constitution to scrap term limits on his position. His youngest brother, Basil, was placed in charge of economic development, while the eldest, Chamal, was appointed parliamentary speaker. According to one estimate, as many as 40 Rajapaksas held political seats, and among them controlled most of the government's finances. After nearly a decade in power, Mahinda's political cronyism sowed distrust in his own voters, and he lost the 2015 presidential election. But a series of Islamist suicide attacks, known as the Easter bombings, 4 years later renewed fears that terrorism would return to Sri Lanka. The Rajapaksa brothers marched onto the campaign trail once again. This time, Gotabaya became president, and Mahinda was appointed his prime minister. Together, they promised prosperity and splendor, but instead delivered soaring inflation and severe food and fuel shortages. To fund their counter-terrorist campaign and capital revitalization projects, the Rajapaksas found a receptive partner in China. Beijing stepped up its foreign investments in South Asia to rival India and the United States. Sri Lanka was central to China's plan to grow global trade, known as the Belt and Road Initiative, and Beijing quickly became Colombo's primary lender, accounting for around 10% of Sri Lankan national debt. The Rajapaksas used Chinese loans to build the Hambantota port. In 2017, Sri Lanka could no longer afford to repay the debt and was forced to hand over the port and its surrounding land to China on a 99-year lease. To stimulate a flailing economy, Gotabaya applied steep tax cuts, which immediately slashed government revenues. And then, in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic hit. The tourism industry, which accounts for 12% of the country's GDP, came to a crashing halt. To save cash for foreign debt repayments, the government banned the import of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides and decreed an overnight transition to organic farming. The result was catastrophic. The island's biggest exports were hit hardest. Tea production fell over 18%, and grain dropped 43%. While the government successfully saved $400 million by banning fertilizer, it spent $450 million to import rice to address the food shortages. And then Russia's invasion of Ukraine drained the country's fuel supply. Thousands waited in line for days just for petrol. Others started walking long distances and cooking with firewood. Skyrocketing costs have led to food shortages. Nearly 5 million people are considered food insecure by the United Nations.
சாப்பாடு சரி கஷ்டம் ஒரு நேரம் சாப்பிட்டு ஒரு நேரத்தில் எல்லாம் பசியில் இருக்கிறோம் யாரை போய்ட்டு கேட்குறது ஒரு நேரம் சாப்பிட இப்போ காலையிலேருந்து நாங்கள் ஒன்றும் சாப்பிட இல்லை யார் தர போகிறோம் எந்த அரசாங்கத்தில் தர்றாங்க
The movement to dethrone the Rajapaksas has been called the struggle, or Aragalaya in Sinhalese. March 31st, 2022, demonstrators marched to Gotabaya Rajapaksa's private residence to protest against worsening economic conditions. April 3rd, the president dissolved his cabinet, which included his brothers Basil and Chamal. Mahinda, however, stayed on as prime minister. May 9th, Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa resigned. Violent clashes left 9 dead and about 300 injured. May 20th, Sri Lanka defaulted on its foreign debt for the first time in its history. July 9th, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa informed the parliamentary speaker of his plans to resign after protesters stormed the official presidential residence. Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe said he was also willing to step down. July 13th, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa fled and ceded power to the Prime Minister. July 14th, he landed in Singapore. July 15th, Sri Lanka's House Speaker officially announced Rajapaksa's resignation. What's next in the struggle is unclear, since the country looks set to remain in crisis, regardless of who's in power. What is clear is that with Gotabaya out of office, this chapter of the Rajapaksa dynasty's story has officially closed. But as history has shown, a fall from grace for this family may not signal the end of their political power.